In today's episode, we address CEO succession. And what's unique is we're going to talk about my succession from the CEO role at Best Christian Workplaces. I found over time that CEO successions and transitions mark a significant change in organizations and often don't go well, especially when it comes to succeeding a founder. As many of you know, we've just had a CEO transition at Best Christian Workplaces, and several have asked, how's it going? Well, listen in as we talk about our succession story. Hi, I'm Al Lopus, and you're listening to the Flourishing Culture Podcast, where we help you create a flourishing workplace. The problem many employers are facing today is readjusting to the post-COVID world. The Great Resignation is still in full swing, where employees are quitting at high levels, with millions of open jobs attracting them, even as we face a cooling economy and record-setting wage inflation. So how can churches, Christian nonprofits, and Christian-owned businesses face these significant challenges while attracting new, outstanding talent? We know that having a flourishing workplace with fully engaged employees is the solution. Yes, we believe a flourishing culture is more important now than ever before. So to lead our conversation today, we've asked Robert Wachter, our Global Marketing Director, to guide our conversation. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you so much, Al. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be on the podcast today. I think we have a very special episode because today we have not only Al Lopus, of course, who's our co-founder and former CEO, but we also have Jay Bransford with us today, who's our new CEO here at Best Christian Workplaces. And today we're going to talk about recent transition that has happened that has resulted in new leadership here with our organization. There's lots of new things happening, of course, with Best Christian Workplaces. We want to bring everyone up to speed on what's been going on, but also we want to share insights that we've gleaned and learned along the way to help you with your leadership transitions. And I think it's safe to say that succession is absolutely essential for leadership. We always want to keep our focus on the future. We're leaders for only a season. And as we kind of grow in our tenure, we begin to shift our focus on how do we lift and empower our future leaders. And that's not an easy thing to do. Transition and change is never easy, but the goal is how do we do this and how do we create a plan that can really work? Ultimately, I think it's our goal and all of our goals to see God continue to use our organizations to fulfill the mission and vision that he started and began often years ago. We want to see that vision continue for many, many years to come. And a lot of times that has everything to do with a successful succession plan. So today I'm delighted to welcome Jay Bransford, the new CEO of Best Christian Workplaces, and Al Lopus, our co-founder and now board chair, who just completed 20 plus years as our CEO. So welcome to the podcast, Jay and Al.
Thanks, Rob. It is great to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. And hi, Jay. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Well, Al, I thought we would start with you. Let's travel back a few years, just a few years ago. There was a point when you just started thinking about, okay, now's the time to begin focusing on a succession plan and preparing for the next season of leadership. How did you know that it was the right time?
Well, yeah, Rob, that's a great start because I'm often asked the question, how do leaders know when God is calling them out of their job? I mean, we talk a lot about people being called into a role or a job and how God is calling them into a new season, into a new job, but we don't really talk about when they're being called out of it. And I've seen too many founder-run organizations that have lost their productive edge and begun to decline. And I didn't want that to happen with us. And so for me, and this is even a longer story than I'm going to describe here, but it kind of happened one night as kind of the beginning of this. It was about 4 years before the actual succession date. And again, we made the succession, the handoff between Jay and I, June 30th this year, 2022. But 4 years ago, I was at a family wedding. I was age 66 and was suddenly confronted with my own mortality. I just thought, wow, as I was around family and, older people and younger people, what if I were to die tonight. BCWI had experienced a quarterly revenue decline about that point, which was just a speed bump after 8 years of significant growth. And that certainly probably was on my mind. But as I was thinking, I'm in good health, yet my mind went to that question: what if tonight were my last night? And so for the first time, I began to think about what a mess. What a mess I would have left my wife, Kathy, and my colleagues that we were all working with together. And at that point, I was not only the CEO and co-founder of the Best Christian Workplaces, but also I had another role. I was the CEO, co-founder, and board chair of a growing Christian ministry in Guatemala called the Nicholas Fund for Education. So I had a lot going on, and I was just thinking, how could this be unwound if I just disappeared? Maybe it's a proverbial hit by a bus. And about that time, I also had a friend who was a ministry leader that had a serious cancer situation that literally caused him to leave his role suddenly, Alec Hill at InterVarsity. Well, my wife, Kathy, she was also basically acting as our chief administrative officer, if not even more like our chief operating officer. And while I knew the team would support her if I disappeared, the weight of the responsibility to lead the transition would have been just really burdensome. And, I didn't want that. I didn't want to leave her in such a difficult spot. Also, as I reflected on it, and as I've reflected on this actually for years, I had the strong conviction that Best Christian Workplaces was a mission God wanted to continue beyond me, beyond Kathy, into the next generation. We had just seen so much transformation as a result of our work, that God had brought this transformation to so many organizations. And so it was time for me to start thinking about a healthy succession. That was really at the core. So I began praying, and prayer has been a core of and a key theme throughout the entire process. So that was pretty much kind of the beginning of the process.
Wow, that's amazing. I've never heard that part of this story before. And I love how God will often create these situations. You weren't expecting it. You were at this event, and the next thing you knew, you started thinking about mortality and what would happen in the future. And somehow God worked that into your heart, which resulted in making that decision, which kind of prompts a next question to this is once you got to that place in your heart and in your vision that you wanted to see a successful succession plan, it kind of begs the question, like, where do you go from there? It's one thing to know you should be doing this or thinking about this, but then there's the practical application of this. So I'm curious, Al, if you could kind of describe for us, how did you plan and implement the succession plan that has resulted in where we are today?
Well, that night was such a stark wake-up call for me. I felt like I needed to start taking action, and quickly. And so the first step, quite frankly, as I analyzed where I was, it was to clear my plate to focus on Best Christian Workplaces transition. That was the key thing. So literally, it was the next Tuesday that we were having a board meeting at Nicholas Fund for Education, and I informed the board that I was going to be transitioning off that board and passing on the CEO role by the end of the year. Now, again, this was the second Tuesday in October, so that's about 10 weeks. And well, anyway, I had faith, and I knew that wasn't going to be a problem. And then actually another person picked it up and has done a great job in the last 3 years. So within a month, another board member, took the role, and I thought to myself, okay, God, check. That was done. And so I knew that God was clearly behind this. And then looking back, it was a full-on 4-year project to fully position BCWI for the future as I look at it. And I'm so grateful at this point that BCWI was in a financially pretty good position. We had saved nearly 6 months of revenue in the bank. So we were ready to assume the cost of succession. I didn't know exactly what that was, but that was kind of a beginning point. And so to help me understand what was needed in the succession, I began to do some reading. As John Pearson says, leaders are readers. And that was something that I really wanted to do. Was, okay, I want to do this right. So I read a couple of books, Scaling Up by Vern Harnish and Traction by Gino Wickman. And I've served on boards and I've gone through successions, and the outcomes of this reading was really helpful for me to formulate a plan. And, I remember reading Scaling Up and coming up with a list of 23 different things that we needed to do to make sure BCWI is in a good position to move forward. I began to think, okay, so number one, we needed an operational leadership team. Kathy and I had been acting as the leadership team all along, and I'm so forever grateful for team members Giselle Jenkins and Carrie Humphreys for stepping up to really take part in our first official leadership team. So this was in March of 2020. You remember what happened then? It was the beginning of COVID. And Kathy and I had a long-term plan that we were going to sell our house and move into a new community at the right time. Well, the right time came up, but was also in the middle of COVID. And here we were trying to sell our house in the beginning of COVID, where in fact, the state law was that people couldn't actually come into our house. So how do you sell a house when people aren't able to come in and look at it? We were just kind of in shell shock. And of course, our investments had just declined about 40% in 3-week period of time. But Carrie and Giselle, and also at the same time, Heather Snyder, stepped into leadership, and we created what was the beginning. We didn't call it a leadership team, but it began to function like a leadership team. And again, thanks to Heather Snyder for stepping in and taking Kathy's role on the leadership team. And that was a key transition. So in a relatively short period of time, we were also, of course, dealing with what are we going to do with COVID. We had a highly functional leadership team, and we'd really worked together now for the last 2 years, and it became very functional and was clearly a successful part of the succession. So leadership team, check, number one. Number two, at the same time, we needed to have, I felt like, an operating system. Again, it was, we were operating much like a mom and pop, and I knew that wasn't really our desire by any stretch, and we knew the limitations of that. So we adopted Gino Wickman's entrepreneurial operating system with the 90 software to work it. And EOS has been fantastic, and it's really moved everything from my head and my heart into a system. The things that I've been doing for 17 years. Now we had a system where we were able to work together and really have a functional leadership team. We had a vision, we had a mission, we had values, but now we had a system to work toward a 10-year goal. We had a 3-year picture, we had an annual plan, we had quarterly rocks, we had a weekly rhythm to carry out the plan. We had an operating system. So that was a key part. Number 3, then the main question was, well, okay, so who's going to be the next CEO? We didn't have anyone on the board that wanted the job, and we didn't have anybody on our team that wanted the job. So the first step was to create a search team from my perspective. And our board at the time was undeveloped. It was Kathy and I and Rob McKenna from Seattle Pacific University. And I wanted to pull a great team of great people who knew our work and could contribute to selecting our next CEO. So I was pleased to have a search team made up of best Christian workplace, certified workplaces that were experienced ministry partners or clients as they are. And they were also leaders in every sector that we served. So Doug Mazza, the president emeritus of Johnny and Friends, and Mike Sharo, the president of C12, Tammy Heim, the president of the Christian Leadership Alliance, Jeff Lockyer, a senior pastor, and also he was the chairman of the Global Leadership Network in Canada, and David Pickering, executive vice president and chief financial officer of Olivet Nazarene University. I mean, these were fantastic people to help us pick a new president. And I'm just really grateful for each of them and their contributions in the process. So the next decision was, okay, so what's the best role that would be that we'd bring this new person into BCWI? And, we had a strong vision, we had a strong mission, so what role should we bring a person in? Should we just bring in a new CEO and just make it you're here one day and gone the next, Al, or are we going to have somebody that's kind of work with us over time for a transition? So we decided to search for a president and chief operating officer to work with us over time before moving into the CEO role. And that was one of the key decisions that we made along the way. So that's number 3, was who's going to be the next CEO. Of course, number 4 was where we were going to find them. And so we hired a search team. And also, our search team was one of our ministry partners. Steve Hayes, the president of the Human Capital Group, which is now the Gallagher search team, was a perfect choice. He and his team knew exactly what we did because we had experienced, or they had experienced working with us and had their own cultural transformation because of the work that they had done with us. So that was a clear, logical choice. Well, all of this happened more than 2 years before the actual succession date. And I was fully aware that the first person hired, I've heard so many stories of these, and I know we all have. Well, sometimes that first person hired doesn't really make it. So I thought, well, we've got to get going on this because if it doesn't work, then it's going to take a lot longer. And so quality was the key criteria over speed. And we're fortunate that that was the case. So let's, number 6, culminating the process was, of course, the hiring of Jay, our new president and COO. And that was almost 2 years before the final succession, June 30, 2022. So the whole process, let me just come back to this, the whole process was bathed in prayer. I remember, Jay and his wife were in Seattle. They had just met with all of our Seattle team, met with Rob McKenna, our other board member. We were in the process of, okay, so what's the decision? Is Jay the guy? And I remember sitting on my deck, a quiet time the next morning, and literally received a word from God that, yes, Jay is the one for the job. And I'll say I've never looked back.
Thank you so much, Al. That's an amazing story and sequence of steps. Obviously, you took considerable prayer and time and strategy to get the organization prepared and ready, and then moving it towards, figuring out who's this person going to be, all the way through, a couple of years, bringing this person on and creating a transition that would ultimately lead to a successful transition that just happened June 30th, 2022, and here we are today. It's fascinating as I hear that over an extended period of time, as you, Al, and Best Christian Workplaces were working on all of these variables, you had Jay living his life as well. And I'm curious, Jay, I'd love to bring you into the conversation at this point, because all the while this is happening and God's working behind the scenes, I'd love to hear from you, your side of the story. Where were you during this time? What were you up to while Best Christian Workplaces was working on this and doing all of this preparation that would ultimately lead to you becoming part of the team?
Yeah, well, thanks, Rob. But my answer to that question might surprise you a little bit. So at the time that God was preparing Al to think more deeply about his succession, I was actually living over 8,000 miles away on the other side of the world in Asia, where I had been serving as a missionary with my wife and my son for over 15 years at that point. And God had given me a very unique role on the international mission field. I served numerous mission organizations and churches and Christian not-for-profits, providing pro bono consulting services, helping them to maximize their performance and the kingdom impact of their organizations. And it was the same kind of consulting work that I'd previously provided in the corporate world for many years. So although I didn't realize it at the time while we were serving on the mission field, God was also preparing me for this transition, just like he was preparing Al. So our son was 2 years old when we left for the mission field and when I quit my corporate job in consulting. And if we fast forward now to us having lived on the mission field for about 15 years at this point, our son was suddenly getting ready to graduate from high school in Thailand. And he decided he wanted to attend university in the USA. And my wife and I had always planned to take a year-long sabbatical when our son moved to the US. And we envisioned it would give us a needed time of rest and allow us to help our son transition to living in the USA, which really was a culture he knew almost nothing about. However, about a year before our son graduated from high school in Thailand, my wife and I felt that God was saying that our time on the mission field was over and that we should return to the US to stay. And needless to say, that was a huge shock to both my wife and to me. And to say that I was anxious about my future in the US would be a significant understatement. So an entire year before our return from the mission field to the US, I began looking into what kind of job opportunities might I have and where and with whom. I knew I wanted to continue to use my consulting background in organizational team and leadership development, and I really wanted to keep serving Christian-led organizations. But I wasn't seeing many opportunities out there. And so I did my best to rekindle my connections with past colleagues from 15 to 20 years ago, most of whom I had hardly talked with during all my years on the mission field. But as God would have it, one of my previous colleagues, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jason Brooks, provided me with what I would call a divine connection to BCWI. So Jason had worked in the same Big Six consulting company that I did, and he and I later worked more directly together during our time with Cracker Barrel Old Country Store. And anyway, Jason was contacted by the search firm that Al hired to find his replacement as CEO. And although Jason wasn't in the market for a job himself, he pointed the search firm to me as a possible candidate. And I have to say, when the search firm reached out to me and shared the job description for BCWI, my jaw literally dropped. I immediately shared the job description with my wife, and she laughed, thinking I was playing a joke on her. She actually accused me of writing the job description myself to describe what I would most love to do: serving Christian-led businesses and not-for-profits and schools and churches, and helping them to become healthy, flourishing, and effective, and modeling Christ in the process. It really was a bit of a dream come true for me just to be introduced to BCWI.
Wow. That's absolutely amazing. I don't think she's laughing anymore, right? She's realizing it's the real thing. That's absolutely an incredible story. Obviously, God was at work, not only with Al and Best Christian Workplaces, but also with JU and your wife and your son and your whole family. And what an incredible story. Jay, when you started as COO, and Al, you were working on the transitioning responsibilities to Jay. There was this season, this time when you guys were working together, and you knew that this transition was underway and there would come a point when it would fully come to fruition. But there was a season of you working together. And I'm curious, I'd love to hear some insights on kind of what happened during that time, what worked well during that time. Al, I thought maybe this would be a good point for you to jump back in and kind of share your experience with that portion of the transition.
Yeah, well, Rob, I have a saying, and a good friend taught me this. It's all about relationships in a lot of ways. And so one complexity that I immediately recognized, I knew it was going to be overcome, but that is that Jay lives in Nashville and I live in Seattle. So, and it's COVID. And in fact, Jay and his wife, was basically after the interview, you went home, you actually got COVID. And so yeah, we were all, very cautious about the travel and during that time. And well, how are we going to develop a relationship being so far apart? Well, we did. And over 18 months, we literally spent at least 30 minutes on Zoom every morning. For me, it was 8:30 out here in the Pacific with our joint virtual assistant. We had a couple of those over that time. Well, this was a very important time for us. And, it's something that Zoom actually helps to facilitate even better than having, sitting in the same office or around a conference table. I was able to transfer 18 years of knowledge and experience to Jay because, we'd go through our schedules. He'd hear what I was up to. I'd transfer historical information about one organization or another. And, when I finally passed the baton to Jay, I was confident he was ready to run with it. There was no question. But one of the things, when you have a CEO, COO relationship, having clearly defined roles is a really important part. And I just encourage our listeners to think about that. Stepping on each other's toes, and that causes conflict. That doesn't help relationships. So immediately we defined our roles with each other. And again, the entrepreneurial operating system was very helpful in that process. I played the visionary CEO role, and Jay was the integrator COO role. And the book Rocket Fuel was very informative. And so we defined our job responsibilities based on that. Much of the overlap, as I mentioned before, was over COVID, and we'd always been a remote team, and we were able to move ahead very well, even as a remote team. But we were intentional about the relationship and spending time together. So it's a kind of an example of quality time often is really quantity of time. And we dedicated a time almost every day where we were together unless we were traveling. So there's another tool that Jay's going to talk about a little later that he brought with him from one of his consulting practice experiences. And that was also very helpful where we defined our responsibilities. And I'll let him describe it.
Awesome. That's really good. So it sounds like a couple key points there. One is you spent considerable time just talking with each other, just getting on Zoom every single morning, sharing your heart, your strategies, your history, your experience, and also having some clear job kind of roles and descriptions to clearly delineate how this was going to move forward. That's incredible insight. So Jay, Al had mentioned a tool that was helpful in this process, and I'd love to hear about kind of your perspective on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, Rob. Let me start out by first saying, though, how thankful I was and still am that Al got some great advice to give us a considerable amount of time to transition. I had a lot to learn and I knew it. And likewise, as Al just said, he had close to 20 years of experience to try to share with me, which takes a lot of time. I was also thankful that Al came into the whole transition process with an amazing attitude. He was extremely patient with me, allowing me to ask all sorts of detailed questions, which I like to do, and allowing me to give my opinion on things about BCWI without him taking offense. And, I can only imagine how many times Al likely bit his tongue and swallowed his pride and let me just drag him into discussions that he already had years of experience with. But the fact that Al was willing to spend that time to explain those things to me until I was comfortable in my understanding of them, that was incredibly helpful. So now to Al's comment about a moment ago about a tool that I brought with me to help with the transition, I'll just say that in my years of providing leadership consulting, I've helped a number of senior leaders create transition plans for themselves. And one way that I helped them was to provide them with a pretty simple transition plan template, which simply gave them a way to think about and to document everything they do on a daily basis and a weekly, monthly, quarterly, and even an annual basis. And also to help them to think about who should they transition each of those things to, and when and how to transition it. So Al and I used that transition plan template for our own transition, which I think we both found very helpful as we met together each week to talk about our transition and how it was going and what we still needed to focus on. So that's the transition tool that I brought with me.
Thank you so much, Jay. That's really helpful. Having that plan, it sounds like if you need some structure and plan to help you roll through, which would otherwise be maybe a chaotic experience in transition. So thank you so much for sharing those insights. I have to say, I haven't been through myself a transition quite like this as you two have, but I have to imagine that along the way, there's some pain points, right? Like any change and transition, there's pain points, there's difficulties, there's pitfalls, maybe disagreements. Al, I'd love to kind of kick this back over to you and ask if you might be willing to share what it was like for you to transition as Jay was taking on more and more responsibility and ownership of his leadership. And I can only imagine as the founder, your heart, soul, and resources and everything poured into the ministry for so many years. What was that like for you?
Well, yeah, Rob, it was my baby. That's what founders often describe. It was, our employee engagement survey, I created it. Our 360, I created it. The core consulting clients that we had that really launched us, I was involved with. It was many ways I could say, yeah, it was my baby. But I've often asked the question. I ask a lot of questions, and I talk with founders that transition. I find more often than not, I'm talking with people that have taken over from founders. And I always get the question, well, especially from founders, well, how did it go? And they always give me the answer, oh yeah, it went just great. And I'm like, yeah, I don't believe that. So I knew that this was God's ministry from the beginning, and I was just a steward of it over time. And I wanted to make this a positive transfer. That was really my attitude. I also reflected on the scripture story of John the Baptist and Jesus. And, John, at the beginning, he was the big deal at the time. And here comes Jesus. And, well, of course, we know how that is. And even John realized I must become less so that he can become more. And I thought to myself, yeah, but John, how did that really feel? And I also wasn't going to find myself in a position of being beheaded, but but I did think back, okay, so how did that feel? Well, okay, about me a little bit. I'm a Myers-Briggs ENTJ. That's called the commander. And I'm an Enneagram 3, and that's called the achiever. And God has given me the gift of leadership as defined in Romans 12. And after Jay had been on board for a couple of months, things were going great. I thought, oh, this transition is really going well. And I was feeling pretty good about giving Jay the reins, and he was taking over the leadership of our leadership teams. And, I'm thinking, wow, this is really going well. And then after one meeting, I experienced a feeling that disturbed me, even scared me. It's like I had this feeling like, Al, you are diminished. I felt diminished. As I was letting go of things, those were things that I liked to do. And I got a lot of fulfillment from doing them. And now I was watching Jay and others experience the joy that I used to have and that I'm not having anymore. And that was a bit of a shock. And what scared me the most was if I played into those feelings, then my desire would be to start to take back some of the leadership. And in my head, I knew that would have been a big mistake. So for the next 6 months, I asked some friends and who can help me through this. And I found a counselor who's with a firm called Liminal Space. It's a firm designed to help people go through transitions. And John DeWall, their executive director, helped me tremendously as I walk through over the next 6 months or so to make sure that I was going to be in good shape, that I wasn't going to get in the middle or in the way of this transition. So leaders, my advice is take advantage of such experts. I mean, it was very helpful for me. John was very helpful at a couple of junctures, not only for me personally, but also to coach us on how to really make this a successful transition. And he was very helpful now a year ago as we had an all-staff meeting and to lead us into some other conversations we'll talk about here in a little bit.
Wow, that's such incredible honesty and transparency, Al. Thank you so much for sharing all of that because, a lot of times we're so focused on mission and vision and organizational things, and sometimes we overlook the personal, emotional, spiritual impact that a transition like this would happen on the person transitioning out and losing those responsibilities. And it sounds to me like almost an unavoidable reality in most cases or many cases for leaders in the midst of transition. So thank you for that wisdom, Al. I think that's going to really help a lot of people to make sure that they're providing themselves with that structure and that support as they go through the emotional side of a practical transition.
I trust you're enjoying our podcast today. We'll be right back after an important word for leaders. I want to tell you about an exciting new opportunity for all of you who want to create and experience a flourishing workplace culture. It's the release of my new book, Road to Flourishing. It describes the 8 keys to boost employee engagement and well-being in your workplace. Let's break the cycles of toxicity, dysfunction, destructive conflict, fear, and unwanted turnover. Road to Flourishing is designed to help you understand what drives employee engagement and how we can move the needle on the health of your organization's culture and performance. This book is designed for you, a Christian leader in business, a church, or nonprofit. It includes real stories of flourishing workplaces as a great tool for your development, a book study with your leadership team, and a developmental resource for your frontline managers. Let's change the narrative and reality. Join the ranks of leaders who are skillfully leading flourishing workplace cultures. Buy Road to Flourishing today, wherever books are sold. And now, back to today's special guest.
So, which kind of leads to another thought here is it's not just Al transitioning or Jay transitioning in, it's also the entire organization, the other leaders on the team and employees and folks that have been working so hard and cared so much about the vision and have loved and served, Al and his mission and vision and Kathy as well for so many years and transition impacts all of them too, right? So Jay, I would love to kind of get your insights here and sort of pick up the story here and share how both of you and Al, helped the staff through this process of transition.
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Let me start by saying that I highly doubt that Al and I's transition was perfect. Time will tell. It's still very early on. I've only been in the CEO role for a few months now, and I am sure I'll make some mistakes along the way. But having said that, I do believe that the transition approach that Al and I took was very healthy and effective to help prepare me and our staff for this transition as best we could. So Rob, as you suggested with your question, the leadership transition process is not just about preparing a new leader, like me in this case, but it's also about preparing your staff and your organization for the new leader, right? So, we all know that being a good leader requires a level of skills and experience, but part of being a successful leader also relies on having enough relational capital and trust built up with your staff that they choose to follow you, especially for the newly incoming leader. So in Al and I's case, I not only had over 20 months to learn everything I could from Al, but I also had that same amount of time to develop relationships and trust with our BCWI leadership team and with every single BCWI staff member. And now I'm not saying that I did any of that perfectly or as completely as I could have, but Al and I did intentionally set aside time for me to get to know every staff person, learn directly from them about their role and about themselves as people. And in our monthly all staff meetings, Al and I gradually transitioned different agenda items in our all staff meetings from Al leading them to me leading them. And our hope was that the staff would gradually experience me taking the reins more and more, so that there wasn't a sudden switchover in our roles, but instead a gradual transition that I'm guessing made it seem smoother in the minds of our staff. We also tried to keep the staff updated about our transition plan, including what we were planning to transition, how we were doing that, and when it would happen. Again, referring to that transition plan document that I mentioned that we put together. Several times throughout our transition, we reached out to our staff and asked for their feedback about how they thought the transition was going, as well as what questions and concerns and suggestions they had. We actually even took time during our annual staff retreat to get feedback about the transition directly from our staff, where they could express themselves in a safe environment without Al or I even being present in the room as they discussed our transition and how it was going. So Al and I incorporated their feedback into our ongoing transition plans. I also took part in going through BCWI's Leadership 360 feedback process so that I could better understand how our staff perceived me as a leader. But overall, we were just hoping that all of these things together would help make the transition easier for our staff to swallow and hopefully lower their anxiety and their concerns, and again, give me more time to demonstrate some competence and to build their trust.
I'll also jump in, Rob.
Absolutely.
One of the other things that along this process, Jay mentioned the 360, and again, that was a great confirmation that things were going well. Another thing we did was right after our all staff meeting last September, and then soon after we do the employee engagement survey. We do the same thing with our staff that we recommend every one of our ministry partners do, and that is to do an annual employee engagement survey. And after we had that transition discussion with our team, and we also began to implement what we heard, our staff told us in terms of the overall culture that it was actually getting a little stronger than it was the year before when Jay hadn't been selected yet. Nobody, we just knew that we were in the middle of a transition and we were searching for a new COO. So actually our employee engagement survey told us that, yeah, we're on the right track. In fact, our staff was really engaged and supportive of what we were doing. In addition to listening to the feedback from our survey, I just want to reiterate the importance of humble inquiry. As Jay outlined, we regularly asked, well, how are things going? And from the time we hired Jay, everyone knew that he and I are different people and we have different personalities. And I really respect Jay for putting all of this and all of himself into the process. It's tough for anyone to come into an organization with a founder, and Jay earned his stripes early on and really responded to the feedback that he received in a very direct and prompt manner. So humble inquiry is a term that I like to use. We also know that trust and respect has to be earned. And Jay he did a great job of earning our trust and respect with the whole team. And one thing that we all were excited about is the way he trained the consultants on a new consulting model that he had learned over the years and how that has radically improved our work. So he began to really show leadership and competence in our area of expertise and what we were bringing to ministry partners. That was also helpful. I'll make a couple of notes here as well, Rob. We had a great transition and a celebration of the transition. So for leaders doing a transition, make sure that there's a celebration of the transition. And on June 30, we had a board meeting. Our leadership team was there. Jay's family was there. We were all in Seattle for our annual board meeting, and we made that a celebration. And yes, we even bought a baton, and I actually handed Jay the baton once the board approved his new selection as the CEO. And I literally passed the baton to Jay with a title on it called CEO Best Christian Workplaces. And that was a very visual for everybody in the room to see that actually I passed the baton. And finally, my advice for any ex-CEO is to get out of town and let the new leadership take over. And within a week, I was in Portugal walking 170 miles in the Portuguese Camino de Santiago. After that, I went to Guatemala on a mission trip, and it was really exciting to see the construction of our new Christian school there. And I celebrated while I was walking on the Camino. I had two things. I celebrated 20 years of BCWI's transformational ministry, and it really gave me some great distance from my old CEO role. I mean, that's the way I look at it. My CEO role is now in the past. I am not the CEO, and quite frankly, God has impressed me that I don't want to be the CEO of Best Christian Workplaces ever again. So I'll just consider that a grace.
Wow. What an incredible story, and a perfect segue to a question I'd love to ask Jay. So, Al, you talked about your time, your sabbatical, the time away, and you don't even really feel inclined to go back in time and become the CEO again, which means now there is a new CEO, and that's Jay, which I'd love to hear as we focus on the past, to focus a little bit on the future. Jay, now that you've taken the reins and you're moving full steam ahead and leading the organization, obviously there's a strong foundation that's been created there, and you're continuing that legacy, but it is a new season, and there's a new way forward, always with a new leader. So what are you looking to do, Jay, looking forward, maybe in the next few years with Best Christian Workplaces as you and the team look ahead?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Rob. There really is a lot to be excited about as I think about the future of BCWI. And you're right that Al created a very strong foundation for BCWI, including an outstanding research-based engagement survey and gathering together some amazing, talented, and dedicated staff, along with an extremely flourishing workplace culture here that he's developed within BCWI. So great foundations. What excites me the most about BCWI is really the potential kingdom impact of our vision that says that Christian-led workplaces can and should set the standard as the best, most effective places to work in the world. And, flourishing workplaces, they require people to work effectively together in unity, right? And as we know directly from the Bible, the unity of believers is not only what Jesus' final prayer on this earth was from John 17, where he prays that believers would be unified as one in order for people to know that God sent him. But we also know that with God-focused unity, there's really no limit to what we as believers and as Christian-led organizations can accomplish for God. We can revisit the story of the Tower of Babel to clearly hear the words from God that when he said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. And just think about what Christian-led organizations can and will achieve as they work in unity together, flourishing in their God-given callings and purposes. That is the thought and the picture that gets me excited every morning as I begin my day. I wonder about what new Christian organizations are going to hear about BCWI today and decide that they want to do all they can to create a God-honoring, flourishing workplace that rocks this world for Christ and that attracts people to Christ. Right now, Rob, BCWI really only works with a small fraction of the total number of Christian-led organizations in the world. There are tons of them, right? So really, BCWI's possibilities for growth and for impact are almost endless. So, Rob, I'm excited to have you on board as you help us to focus on growing the awareness of BCWI around the world and of the power and the impact that culture has on organizational effectiveness. I'm excited about the expansion of our consulting team. We're going to be expanding our consulting services. We are continuously expanding our research in the field of engagement and continuously looking at upgrading our technology to bring the best data and the best analysis and the best reporting capabilities possible to our ministry partners. So, Rob, the future is indeed very exciting.
That's amazing, especially being newer on the team. That's so amazing to hear and inspiring to consider the possibilities of impacting more organizations, which will ultimately impact the name of God and the cause of Christ on this planet. So it's so amazing and exciting. But in all of this, as we look to the future, Al, you too have a future. You too have future plans, not just the organization that you led for so many years. So I think we would all love to know, what are your passions for helping organizations continue to flourish in this new and next season of your life? And what's next for you, I guess, as you live out that vision in this next season?
Yeah, interesting. Just the question reminds me of walking on the Camino. And that was my question to God. Okay, God, am I done? You've really guided me through this whole thing. You've brought BCWI to life. Is that going to be the story for me or what? And well, he convinced me. I just had the tremendous reassurance that no, my life is going to continue. I'm going to have impact going forward. With BCWI, I've got a couple of roles that we've talked about. First, I'm the board chair, and I've planned to be fully involved in building our board and our process for the board over at least the next 3 years. Secondly, the team has asked me to continue this podcast, and it's something that I'm very interested in. We've seen great progress in the number of downloads in just the last 6 months with this podcast. So I look forward to being able to even pay more attention on this and to be a voice for creating flourishing workplaces. And lastly, one of the career highlights that I had just happened last April, and that was the publishing of my new book, The Road to Flourishing. So I plan to continue doing workshops and speak about my book that was just launched. And, as I walk down the Camino and as I come back and I'm even thinking about updating my personal mission. Yes, I do have a personal mission statement. And as I look back, I've always found myself helping people, helping leaders, helping organizations catalyze flourishing. So one thing is for sure, I don't find joy in golfing, but I do find joy in having an impact on others. And I expect that God will lead me to do that.
Oh, that's amazing. That's so incredible. And we're, of course, excited that you will be continuing the podcast and growing the board of the best Christian workplaces and so many other things. So it sounds like once God puts a mission and a vision on your life, no matter what season of life, that vision and mission will continue to be carried out all the way. So that is incredibly inspiring. Al, thank you so much for sharing all of that. And thank you, Jay, as well. As we kind of continue the podcast and wrap it up here, so many incredible insights to be gleaned from this conversation, all the way from, Al, your process of discovering the need to continue to start thinking about a succession plan and putting that plan together and begin to move it forward in a real and actionable way. From Jay, what God was doing in your life and in your family's life as he was preparing you guys. And, little did you know that the perfect dream role was just ready for you, and God's faithfulness to you in that process, and the challenges along the way of transition and succession planning, the emotional challenges and all the strategies that you both put in place. So incredibly valuable for everyone listening to this podcast, and amazing to hear what's happening in the future, where BCWI is headed, and Al, of course, where you're headed and the things that you're doing. So thank you both so much for all of this incredible wisdom, transparency, and insight. I can't imagine how valuable this podcast will be for so many people who are in the middle of this or considering this process themselves. So I guess I'd like to ask if there's anything else that either of you would like to share or add to what we've talked about today.
Yeah, Rob, for me, besides thanking Al once again for his willingness to plan ahead for his transition and for his willingness to truly trust and to let go, I think the last thing I'd like to add to this discussion, maybe more as a reminder, is that leadership transition is virtually an absolute requirement in this world. Leaders don't last forever, and healthy organizations ought to outlive their leaders. So as leaders, if we want our organizations to survive and to flourish once we move on, we absolutely must be proactive in taking time to think about how can we prepare others to carry on the leadership mantle and to help our organization achieve even greater things in the future. So here's my suggestion and advice. Just consider whether you currently have leaders in your organization that have the potential to replace you, or consider whether you need to look outside of the organization for the right person. As Al did, look into getting a transition coach, put together a well thought out transition plan, and really just start the transition thinking and planning process years prior to when you believe you'll likely leave. For me, the question is, do you care enough about your organization to want to set it up for long-term success? If so, then start planning today.
Wow. Amen to that.
Amen.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
Rob, as I think about your question at this point, I'm just so grateful and thankful that I was able to be called by God to help create this organization that equips and inspires Christian leaders to create flourishing workplaces so that, as Jay mentioned earlier, our vision is that Christian workplaces set the standard as the best, most effective places to work in the world. And I'm just so thankful to have been such a small part in starting and leading this work. As we've seen, and so grateful to see hundreds of organizations improve the health of their workplace cultures and thus, I believe, attract more to Christ. So I'm thankful for that. And secondly, I just have to say it again, as I've said to so many leaders, one of the best gifts that you can leave your successor is a flourishing workplace culture. And I'm so grateful for each of our 18 team members that have come to work every day and who have put the time and energy into building our culture. I'm also thankful to God to letting me finish strong. And I'm especially grateful that he brought Jay to us. So thank you, Lord. And Jay, I'm just so grateful for the way you followed God in this process. So I really appreciate and have affection for Jay and our leadership team, and whatever the challenges, I know they'll be able to navigate them. Rob, I'm thankful for you, and from a people perspective, BCWI is in the best position that it's ever been in from a people perspective. And I'm also grateful that my book, Road to Flourishing, is published and so well received. And so not everything is perfect. So I'm so grateful that God has let me finish in such a strong note and release me for this new season. But one last thing I have to say, I am just so grateful for my wife, Kathy. And for such a long time, this was the Kathy and Al show. And I can honestly say BCWI would not exist today if it were not for Kathy Lopus. She's been the glue that has kept the engine running day in and day out. And in the next couple of months, she'll be wrapping up her role working on sales and administration. And I'm just so grateful, not only for her love and caring, but also for her partnership in this work. So I can't say enough about the role that Kathy Lopus has played in the success of BCWI.
Wow. Thank you so much, Al. I mean, I know that we're all so blessed here within the organization for both you and Kathy, and of course you as well, Jay. Thank you both so much for this honest conversation today. It actually meant so much to me to hear these stories and to glean these insights. And I appreciate your commitment to the vision of flourishing workplaces. That's what this is all about. That's what we care about so much. And Best Christian Workplaces has been making a difference for God's kingdom for over 20 years, if you can believe that. And we're looking forward to seeing, what happens in the next season of growth and influence as God just continues to build on this foundation, seeing more and more Christian-led organizations flourish and make a greater kingdom impact. So thank you both. Thank you for taking the time out of your day and speaking into the lives of so many listeners. And thank you to all of our listeners for taking time out of your day to participate and share in this podcast with us.
Thanks, Rob. And I'm so thankful to have you on board with us too.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. This has just been great.
Amen. Well, thank you all. We'll see you next time on the podcast.
Thank you for joining us on the Flourishing Culture podcast and for investing this time in your workplace culture. If there's a specific insight, story, or action step you've enjoyed, please share it with others so they can benefit too. Please share this podcast with friends on social media and show your support by rating, reviewing, and subscribing wherever you listen. This program is copyrighted by the Best Christian Workplaces Institute. All rights reserved. Our social media and marketing manager is Shalapi Osoba. Remember, a healthy workplace culture drives greater impact and growth for your organization. We'll see you again soon on the Flourishing Culture podcast.